We're following breaking news now. President Trump says he fired National Security Advisor John Bolton. In a tweet, the president says he, quote, disagreed strongly on many issues, as did others in the administration. He says Bolton submitted his resignation earlier this morning. We'll have much more on this story later on CBS 4 News at 5.
We have some breaking news out of the White House right now. President Trump has fired his national security advisor, John Bolton. The president tweeted the announcement moments ago, writing, quote, I informed John Bolton last night that his services are no longer needed at the White House. I disagreed strongly with many of his suggestions. Mr. Trump thanked Bolton for his service and says he will be naming a new national security advisor at some point next week.
There is some other breaking news I think we need to deal with here. We're just seeing via, well, where else but Twitter, President Donald Trump says, I've informed John Bolton, that is, of course, the National Security Advisor, last night that his services are no longer needed at the White House. I disagreed strongly with many of his suggestions, as did others in the administration, and therefore I asked John for his resignation, which was given to me this morning. I thank John very much for his service. I will be naming a new National Security Advisor next week. I think we've got Alan Fisher, actually, to talk through this one. Alan, what's going on? This seems like a surprise.
One, a surprise, and two, this is pretty brutal for Donald Trump. Normally, when people are fired by tweet, and he's done that a few times in the past, then it's we've had a disagreement or his resignation has come and we know they've been fired. But here, this is pretty brutal, saying, I asked for his resignation. There were a number of disagreements that we didn't agree with his point of view, and that was the same with other people in the administration. And so John Bolton is out the door. What is also surprising is that less than a couple of hours ago, we got a message from the White House saying that there will be a briefing at 1:30 this afternoon. Mike Pompeo will be there. Steve Mnuchin, who's the business secretary, the Treasury secretary, he'll be there. And John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, will be there. I'm going to guess that John Bolton probably isn't going to be there now. Now, there have been disagreements between John Bolton and Donald Trump and between John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. Mike Pompeo was very much in favour of peace talks with the Taliban, which, of course, Donald Trump told us yesterday were now over. John Bolton was completely against that idea. So it appears that Mike Pompeo, if there's a battle between the two advisors, Mike Pompeo has won.
And we have some breaking news coming from the White House this afternoon. We have just learned that President Trump has fired National Security Advisor John Bolton. In a tweet, President Trump says he has asked for Bolton's resignation as of last night. The firing comes after months of clashes between the two over disagreements on how to handle major foreign policy challenges. Bolton was supposed to speak with reporters at the White House this afternoon. The president says he will name a new national security advisor as early as next week.
But Donald Trump has always quite liked John Bolton. He, in fact, thought about him as making him Secretary of State right at the very beginning of his administration, but always the TV producer. He decided he didn't look the part. He wasn't from, to quote Donald Trump, central casting, particularly with his big moustache, and therefore he kept him as an informal advisor. Now, Mike Flynn was initially his national security advisor. He didn't last very long. We remember that, with problems with communications with the Russians. He then had General McMaster, who was his national security advisor for a while, but he didn't particularly gel with Donald Trump. And then he appointed John Bolton, darling of the right, very hawkish on Iran. Everyone thought this was a good appointment for Donald Trump, particularly given his stance on Iran. But it seems that John Bolton has just run out of room, that there is nowhere else for him to go in this administration. Donald Trump has decided he doesn't want his voice in his ear anymore. And as I say, if there has been a power struggle between the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, it looks like you can chalk this one up as a victory for Mike Pompeo.
Can I just go back to what you were talking about? Actually, it's what President Trump said when he said disagreed strongly. Just specifically, what were the big ones? Because John Bolton was always seen as he said it, this hawk, this very big player in the administration. What were the big things which have been the downfall in the end?
Well, a lot of things, of course, will be argued behind closed doors, but what we can guess at are Iran. John Bolton wrote a number of op-eds saying this was the right time for a war with Iran, that there should be armed confrontation, that we should be getting into a battle there with Iran. Donald Trump although he's very much in favour of putting pressure on Iran, has backed away a couple of times from any sort of armed conflict with Iran. And although he's getting voices from Jerusalem, particularly Netanyahu, saying they've got to confront Iran, Donald Trump doesn't want to get involved in a Middle East war, and particularly not 18 months or so away from, 2 years away from a presidential election. And then Afghanistan. Donald Trump's foreign policy is driven a lot by the idea of what has no one else done? And no one else has taken the Taliban along and had peace talks with them face-to-face in Washington itself. Now, this was an idea floated by Donald Trump that he wanted the Taliban leaders, if you believe reports initially at the White House, and that was put on hold because that simply wouldn't be a good idea, but then to take them to Camp David. But to do it this week, the meeting was meant to take place on Sunday. This is the week of the 9/11 commemorations. Donald Trump himself will be at the Pentagon tomorrow, on Wednesday, to mark the attack there. He will also take part in the national moment of remembrance at the time the first planes hit the towers in Washington, in New York. And so there's been this disconnect between John Bolton and also Donald Trump for a while. Donald Trump knew what he was getting with John Bolton, but he, of course, believes in taking his own advice. He said that about the meeting with the Taliban. I took my own advice. Not quite entirely sure how you do that. So clearly there's been a disconnect with John Bolton, and he was told last night, thanks very much, John, it's all over, there's the door, leave your resignation as you're walking out.
Extraordinary development, and I'm sure we'll be talking to Alan Fisher more about it in the coming hours. Thank you, Alan. The breaking news in just the past few minutes. As Alan Fisher's been telling us, John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, the third National Security Advisor that there has been in this Trump administration, has been fired by Donald Trump. It's come out by tweet. It's come out with very strong language as well, with Donald Trump saying he strongly disagreed with John Bolton on many issues and therefore asked for his resignation, which was given. Another big name out the door in this Trump administration. We'll look to more reaction and analysis on that in the coming hours.
Here's the important thing about Bolton's dismissal. It's the tone of President Trump's dismissal. It's clearly this is not amicable. We know that there have been huge divisions within the administration, most recently surfacing up over what to do about Afghanistan, more than just hosting the Taliban at Camp David. This got to the core of what President Donald Trump campaigned on, and that is getting out of foreign wars. We know that Bolton was a little bit more for staying there longer. We know Pompeo was on the other side of this. This is also a clear win for Mike Pompeo as he continues to consolidate power. Now, Bolton is the fourth national security advisor this president has had. Fourth or third or fourth, let me correct myself here as I count them all up, but he is the fourth. So it's an indication of, yet again, more recycling at the top. And Andrea, this has long-term implications for a whole host of issues. That's Iran, that's North Korea, that's the Middle East peace process, that's Venezuela. John Bolton was integral in all those conversations. The president has often said that he liked Bolton's hawkish nature, and he almost liked to have the gamut, the spectrum of people there to make the case that he could always be more bellicose himself. But Bolton is out. We need to figure out just what the proximate cause is, and importantly, who will replace him and what it means for the direction of this administration and what it means for a whole host of issues across the globe. Andrea?
And, of course, Bolton almost auditioned for the job as a Fox News commentator, very vigorously against Iran, as is Pompeo. So on that, they did not disagree. But he has been driving a lot of the action on Iran. Certainly was not comfortable with the president suggesting at the G7 that he would be willing to talk to Iranian leaders. You've got the UN General Assembly meetings coming up the week of September 23rd. So in 2 weeks, we're there in New York for the UN meetings. The president's giving a major speech on the 24th at the United Nations. And now his national security advisor has been fired. One other thing about John Bolton, I just wanted to point out, and I'm going to bring in Ned Price now on the phone, former special assistant to President Obama who worked at the NSC. The big difference between John Bolton and all of his predecessors going back in any administration that I've ever covered is he did not oversee the deputies' meetings. He did not convene other agencies. He operated unilaterally very frequently. So he was not factoring in the opinions of the Pentagon, of the CIA, of the State Department in decisions that he brought to the president. And that was one subject of a lot of criticism. Even when I was interviewing Dan Coates, somewhat famously now, in retrospect, last summer in Aspen, when that tweet went out from the White House that Putin, 5 days after the very controversial meeting in Helsinki with Vladimir Putin, that Putin was being invited to the White House. The intelligence community, the Secretary of State had not been consulted. That was all the president, apparently in communication with Putin, to Bolton, directly to Sarah Sanders to tweet out the invitation, Hans, and without consulting anyone else in the national security team as to whether this was a good or a bad idea. Hans?
Yeah, in some ways, Bolton ran his own Defense Department, his own State Department. You'll recall the time when they announced this additional carrier strike group that was going to be heading to the Middle East. That didn't come from the Pentagon. That didn't come from the State Department. It didn't come from the president. It came from the national security advisors. So what you saw from Bolton was trying to put the pressure on the president, sometimes almost boxing him in to more bellicose positions, to more hawkish positions. This has been a fundamental tension throughout the Trump administration, and that is, to what extent is he going to be a traditional Republican and a traditional interventionist, and what extent is he going to be an isolationist? Trump's impulses on this are clear. He always wanted to draw down from Afghanistan. He always wanted to get out of certain wars. You saw that with Syria as well. The president wanted to bring down troops there. Even though President Trump criticized Barack Obama for what Trump said at the time was withdrawing from Iraq too soon. The question that should really be of the hour is, how fundamental is this split within the administration now? Or is it clear that the isolationists have won? And are there any counterweights to sort of this Bolton-Trump axis? We got a hint of one over the weekend, and that is that Mike Pence was on the other side of this Afghanistan decision. And don't forget, Mike Pence cannot be dismissed. He is a constitutionally ensconced vice president. So if he has disagreements with the president, those cannot be easily dismissed by simply firing the vice president. Again, this gives us a sense that these splits are real, that there's serious debate within the administration about the course of certain foreign policies, and we need to figure out just what that means and where across the globe. Remember, the president may be meeting with the Iranians. You mentioned the United Nations meeting next week. The president may be meeting with the Iranians. The North Koreans just last night suggested that they're willing to have a third or fourth meeting, depending on how you count the one that they had in the DMZ. That's after they sent projectiles into the ocean there. And then a question on what the next stages will be in the Middle East, especially with Netanyahu in Israel right now, talking about annexing more of the Jordan Valley. So tumultuous time, different time, and now we potentially have a new advisor coming in to talk to the president. Guys?
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.
We have John Roberts is at the White House right now, I believe, reacting to this breaking news and running out to a microphone. Thank you. We appreciate that so much. What strikes me here is the wording. I informed John Bolton last night that his services are no longer needed at the White House. That's rough.
Yeah, it is. I mean, that's not surprising that the president did that. What is surprising is that John Bolton was listed in the media schedule today as giving a briefing with Mike Pompeo and Steve Mnuchin at 1:30 this afternoon. But here's what I can tell you, because I've been talking to folks at the White House on an off-the-record basis about this, or the administration on an off-the-record basis about this. John Bolton was quickly falling into disfavor among some very significant players here at the White House, most recently because of his disagreement with the president over having the Taliban at Camp David, and B, the overall peace plan for Camp David. Sources who are familiar with the conversations that Bolton had with the president about all of this said that he did not agree with bringing the Taliban to Camp David, didn't think that was a good idea. Also wanted to see U.S. forces drawn down to 8,600 and then stabilized there, but not go beyond that. We also know that Bolton has been at odds with the president on occasion over North Korea. Certainly, Bolton is a hawk on Iran, and he and the president were pretty much aligned on that front. But there were certain areas where Bolton had run afoul of the president in a way that the president eventually became tired of and decided that his services were no longer required. Again, this has been building over the course of several months, but it's just been in recent days that this thing really has taken on a terrific amount of momentum. And the way that people inside the White House, who were in very high positions, were talking about him, you knew that he was likely on his way out the door soon. A little bit of a surprise that it happened this quickly, but not a surprise that the president tweeted that he asked for his resignation last night.
John, a quick question. So the president, you know, he likes having people around him who disagree and disagree vigorously. John Bolton has been very outspoken since the time he spent here. For as long as I've known him, he has always spoken his mind very firmly. What changed now? And when you say that there, I mean, other than him being against the Taliban coming, he's been for and against a lot of things in the past. And you say there are significant people in the White House now who were really unhappy with him. Like who? Can you give us a hint?
No, I can't, because these have been all off-the-record conversations, but let's just say it's at the highest levels of the White House. And I think that perhaps the straw that broke the camel's back was this idea that Bolton was opposed to what was going on potentially at Camp David with the Taliban, and people were letting it be known that he was at odds with that. You know, the administration was putting on this face of unity surrounding this idea of going to Camp David. We heard from Secretary Pompeo and the vice president that they were, quote, in alignment with the president on decisions that he was making about the Taliban, even though we know that Pompeo and Zal-Khalilzad were really driving this idea of a peace plan, and that the vice president, the National Security Advisor Bolton, and the CIA, that's the other name I was looking for, were all very skeptical about this idea because they know what happened before 9/11 when the Taliban was in control. But I think the fact that people were specifically coming out to say that Bolton disagreed with the president might have been the straw that broke the camel's back there. But again, this is something that has been building over time. To some degree, the president appreciated Bolton's contrary positions, certainly appreciated his forcefulness, his hawkishness on a number of different issues. But if I were to, I don't think you can peg it to any one thing, but I think the turning point was what happened over the last couple of days regarding Camp David and the Taliban.
John, are there any candidates to see who might replace him?
I mean, there's always candidates, Brian, none that have really been talked about openly in recent months, even though, you know, Bolton appeared to be falling out of his favor. We didn't know that he was probably going to be replaced this soon, but we'll dig around a little bit. This announcement's just come out, and we'll find out who might be topping the list. But certainly the president's got a number of candidates. He always does for literally every job that's out there.
Welcome to Inside Politics. I'm John King. Dramatic breaking news just as we begin the hour. The President of the United States announcing on Twitter his National Security Advisor, John Bolton, is leaving. You see the tweet from the president right there. I asked for John for his resignation, which was given to me this morning. I thank John very much for his service. I will be naming a new National Security Advisor this week. There have long been tensions between the president and his National Security Advisor, long been tensions between the National Security Advisor and the rest of the president's national security team, including the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. But the timing here is striking as the administration continues to try to work out its policy when it comes to Iran. Just moments ago, the Israeli Prime Minister announcing his plans to greatly expand Israeli control, to annex parts of the West Bank. So a dramatic foreign policy development from the President of the United States this morning as we try to get more on this breaking news story. Here with me in studio to share their reporting and their insights, CNN's Nia Malika Henderson, Molly Ball with Time, Heather Cagle with Politico, and Vivian Salama with the Wall Street Journal. Let me start with you, Vivian. We know there's been tensions for a long time. The White House has always spun this as the president likes creative tension. He likes this. Clearly, his patience with John Bolton, who has been among the more hawkish advisors, has differed with the president on issues like Russia. Why now?
Well, in the last couple of days, we've seen a lot of tension between President Trump's top advisors, specifically with this meeting that was supposed to take place a couple of days ago, but was called off with regard to finding a peace plan for Afghanistan. John Bolton, according to my reporting and as well as yours, your teams, that John Bolton was very much against the president meeting with the Taliban, as were a number of his advisors. He felt that this was not the approach, and a lot of tension between his top advisors as to what the proper approach to the Afghanistan strategy should be. But this is not new. President Trump has frequently cited the fact that John Bolton has what he called strong views. He is a hawk, and President Trump does like the differing opinions, but a number of policies that just didn't come through in terms of his Venezuela strategy. John Bolton was really, really aggressive trying to find a solution, get Venezuela's President Maduro out. President Trump growing impatient with that strategy. Also Iran. President Trump wanted to take a more moderate approach to Iran. John Bolton, always a hawk on Iran, wanted to take some military action a couple of months ago when they shot down a drone over the Gulf. And so a number of different foreign policy issues where John Bolton obviously seeing differently to the president. This was very dramatic because as much as we've known there's tension inside the White House, we didn't necessarily think that this was imminent. And here we go.
And that is the question of timing. Let's get straight to CNN's Caitlin Collins, who is at the White House. Caitlin, an odd fit from day one, but why now?
Well, that's the question, John, and let me remind the viewers that John Bolton is supposed to participate in a briefing here at the White House in about an hour and a half. This was going to be on this executive order they were signing on counterterrorism. He was going to appear alongside the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and the Treasury Secretary, Stephen Mnuchin, but now the president has announced that he has fired John Bolton. What's striking, John, about the president's tweet here also is that typically the president will announce when someone's leaving the White House saying that they are leaving by choice. Like when Jim Mattis resigned in protest, the president and his officials framed it as a retirement initially. But this is the president stating pretty clearly that he has asked John Bolton to leave his position as National Security Advisor. Now, this won't come as a huge surprise because there was a lot of infighting in the White House, and just last week CNN reported on just how badly that infighting in the administration had come, where Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and John Bolton had gone for several weeks recently without even speaking to each other. That had changed a little bit to where they were not speaking outside of formal meetings, a big change in that relationship that you used to see, but also a lot of this had to do with John Bolton as an isolated national security advisor who was not only at odds with the president often at times, but also the Secretary of State, who is highly favored by the president, and even the Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney. We also reported on this breakdown in the NSC staff and the West Wing staff. So this is substantial, though people did see this coming for some time now because the divisions just seem to be too strong in the West Wing for John Bolton to make it much longer. But we should note that John Bolton and his people weren't exactly sure when his time would come, whether or not he would be fired or whether or not he would be able to hang around in this administration. And when we reported last week that John Bolton had his eyes on Mike Pompeo's job as Secretary of State, his aides did not push back on that, John.
And to that point, Caitlin Collins, come back to us as the reporting continues throughout the hour, as we are sure it will. Let's go to CNN's Kylie Atwood. She's at the State Department. Kylie, Caitlin at the White House just mentioning, A, the plans, the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor were supposed to be side by side today, and B, also mentioning as part of that the long simmering, long running tensions between the two of them.
That's right. So even though these two leaders in Trump's national security team are ideologically aligned, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and National Security Advisor, who is now leaving the administration, John Bolton, there has been simmering tensions, as Caitlin referenced, between the two for months now. And we have reported on that extensively. We know that there has been instances in which National Security Advisor John Bolton has actually asked for intelligence on North Korea, which is an issue that Secretary Pompeo had owned, and not shared that intelligence with Pompeo, using it as leverage in conversations when he is speaking with President Trump to try and push forward his agenda. Now, we know National Security Advisor Bolton is an Iran hawk. He wanted to be the one. He was pushing President Trump to take a strike on Iran earlier this year. President Trump decided not to do that. There's also been a breakdown between the president and his national security advisor when it comes to other issues. Venezuela is one of them, with Bolton pushing for a harder stance on Venezuela, and some of what he was trying to push for not coming yet to fruition. Clearly, with him leaving, it's going to be a question mark in terms of who comes into that role, because this is something that we weren't expecting today. We knew that there were tensions. We knew that President Trump had grown increasingly frustrated with Bolton, Specifically, during a recent trip to the UK, it was National Security Advisor John Bolton that made the first trip to visit with the new leadership under Johnson, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and it was not the other U.S. officials who were there meeting with him. So Bolton was trying to get out ahead, but clearly President Trump has grown frustrated in the instances where he has gotten out ahead of the president and is asking him to leave. We're waiting for some responses from the State Department in terms of how they are going to respond to this and what it means for Secretary of State Mike Pompeo as he assumes even more control over the national security agenda of this administration.
Kylie Atwood, come back to us again if there is more reporting. And you mentioned Secretary of State Pompeo assuming more control. There's also a question as to whether Secretary Pompeo may leave in the coming months to run for a Senate seat open in his home state of Kansas. I just want to go back for those of you who may be joining us a little later than the top of the hour. The President of the United States announcing on Twitter just moments ago his National Security Advisor, John Bolton, is out. Here's how the President did it in this tweet. I informed John Bolton last night that his services are no longer needed at the White House. I disagreed strongly with many of his suggestions, as did others in the administration, and therefore I asked John for his resignation, which was given to me this morning. I thank John very much for his service. I will be naming a new National Security Advisor next week. John Bolton came in after H.R. McMaster left the White House. Secretary Pompeo, of course, replacing Secretary Tillerson. At the Defense Department, Secretary Esper replaces James Mattis. There's been a lot of turnover in the president's foreign policy team. I believe we have on the phone Aaron David Miller, our CNN diplomatic analyst, former State Department negotiator in both Democratic and Republican administrations. Aaron, more turnover. What does it mean?
You know, 2 secretaries of state, including the shortest tenured Secretary of State in the modern history of the Republic, Rex Tillerson, and 3 national security advisors in 3 years during a period of incredible consequence in American foreign policy, disruption, dysfunction, and misdirection in the nation's foreign policy. I suspect, given the harshness of this tweet, compared with so many of the more gentle letdowns that the president sets the tone in dismissing his senior officials, that Bolton must not have simply disagreed with the president. He must have pushed some red line and pushed it hard. That's number one. Number two, the president's political advisors, who knows who's whispering in his ear on this one, may simply have said that there's too much broken crockery. Pompeo, who is a keeper, assuming he decides to stay, is a much better Trump whisperer than John Bolton. And I think that it's an extraordinary, having watched this for 25 years, played a part in this movie, John, it's an extraordinary series of scenes that we're witnessing.
You mentioned the tone, and you're absolutely right. The president normally finds, both for the person leaving and for himself, the spinning of that this is not chaos, a more gentle way to say goodbye to somebody. This is not a gentle. This is a slam the door on the way out. You know John Bolton. I remember him from the George W. Bush administration. He is known, A, for being polarizing, B, for being very brittle at times, if you will, in his relationships, but C, and importantly, he's also known as a survivor because of his ability to work the system behind the scenes, if you will, to be a bureaucratic survivor, and in fact sometimes to work the bureaucracy to do things that maybe others at the table didn't want to happen. Is that what you're pointing at here?
Well, it's true, except, you know, Bolton's masterful manipulation of the bureaucracy, and I watched it up close during the first Bush administration, occurred, you know, not in a galaxy far, far away with respect to basic rules of diplomacy. They occurred in a system which was relatively predictable. This is not predictable. You have a mercurial, idiosyncratic president who acts largely on the basis of his domestic politics, his ego, and his personal sensibilities. I think this was not an environment in which that played to Bolton's strengths clearly, and I really do believe that Pompeo had a much better read on how to handle the president. Bolton pushed John, and I suspect on this one, he pushed one bridge too far.
To that point, Pompeo has been able to disagree with the president without being disagreeable. On John Bolton, clearly, who has more proximity, probably sees the president more often, definitely sees the president more often. Maybe that prickly nature became too much.
We're learning that John Bolton didn't just leave the White House. He was essentially fired. A tweet from the president: I informed John Bolton last night that his services are no longer needed at the White House. I disagreed strongly with many of his suggestions, as did others in the administration, and therefore I asked John for his resignation, which was given to me this morning. I thank John very much for his service. I will be naming a new national security advisor next week. What do you mean?
Well, look, on the deal with the Taliban in Afghanistan, John Bolton was an adamant opponent of bringing the Taliban, the Afghan government, to Camp David to continue negotiating. He was against the deal with the Taliban entirely. So if you go against the president's policies, he also had been an advocate in the past of a direct strike and regime change in Iran.
But the president did end up, because of this attack that killed a U.S. serviceman, shelving the talks anyway.
Right, but he didn't change his policy. He wants to remove troops. John Bolton was for a much more limited drawdown of the troops. I think this makes sense from a policy point of view. If the National Security Advisor and the president are going in different directions, Neil, one of them has to go, and the president only goes after an election.
Well, but I do think that, I think that the American people are immune to the revolving door in the White House.
I agree with that, yeah.
I will say that, normally this would be an unbelievable big breaking news flash, but because we have so many people either getting fired or choosing to leave, it's been a non-stop revolving door. So that one advantage to the White House is that we're pretty much immune to the breaking news signal of somebody leaving the White House.
And he was sort of on the outs prior, right?
Yes.
Blake Berman at the White House. You have more on this, Blake?
Here's what's so unusual about this one. I know, as your guest just said, Neil, we're kind of numb to these things around here because this happens within this administration at a fairly normal pace at this point, I guess you could say. John Bolton was scheduled to be inside the Brady briefing room in about an hour and a half's time, along with the Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. The White House put out that updated bulletin about 30-40 minutes ago. Yet we learned from the president that last night he had asked for John Bolton's resignation, that it was delivered to the president this morning, and John Bolton, if he's not left the White House already, is in the process of doing so. So clearly, Neil, there was some sort of someone didn't get the message, because the White House had told us about a half an hour ago, 45 minutes ago, that John Bolton would be inside this building briefing the media alongside Steve Mnuchin and the Treasury Secretary and the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. One other thing, Neil, the president often says how he likes different voices in the room. I just jumped in, so maybe you covered this, and apologies if you did. But John Bolton was very clearly a different voice in the room. Oftentimes, the president holds that up as a good thing. In this case, he is holding it up as something that necessarily wasn't warranted and needed change. Neil?
Yeah, normally, Blake, to your point, someone submits their resignation, and that's the end. You hear later on about the theater and what was going on behind the scenes. In this case, the president himself saying, as you reported, that I informed John Bolton that his services are no longer needed at the White House, as if to make the point emphatically clear it was coming from him. So
right.
I'm beginning to wonder whether
for the person who's known it, the person who's known as saying you're fired, that's another way of saying you're fired.
Yeah, but apparently not to the degree that this was even passed along to the authorities that made this planned event later on today, right?
Yeah, I mean, let me I go through my phone if I have a second here, but, the White House put out this briefing, gosh, what time was it? At any event, within the last hour or so, and at around what time, Ralph? At around 10:50 or so about an hour ago. And now we are learning very clearly that John Bolton will not be at that briefing.
All right.
Or at least we don't anticipate.
Got it. Would that be something if no one got the word John Bolton? He shows up. What are you guys looking at? All right. Thank you, my friend. Very, very much, Blake Berman. Noel, when I see this, and you talked about turnover at the White House, it's been particularly pronounced. Jim Mattis was getting into that with me, but said that, presidents are free to pick and choose who they want around them. This one just goes through more than most. But what are we to glean from that?
Well, I think what, what you're to take from that is this is how Trump is doing business. This is not, I don't think it's very normal that, past presidents have had this much of a turnover in this many positions. Also, there are some positions, from what I've heard, that are still not being filled. So he's got, some open spots still. And then in some of the key positions, think about how many positions, White House communications, White House press secretaries, defense. Think about how many times that has turned over.
But I would flip it around. I would look at that and say, when you have an absentee landlords and all these apartments and all, the economy is doing very well, to your point, Charles. Life is going on. You don't want to minimize the significance of a national security advisor stepping down on the heels of so many other key players in and outside the cabinet doing the same. But if it's hurting us economically or hurting us on the global sphere, maybe it's the perception becomes a reality, but it hasn't shown it.
No, it hasn't shown it. And I'm just not sure why anybody is surprised by the same person who had 3 campaign managers during the election, right? So, this is not, he had a show, to Blake's point, where the tagline was, "You're fired." President Trump comes out.
But he's rarely done it himself, right?
The point is, it doesn't happen without him, right? So I think the most important thing here is,
But I remember Rex Tillerson, the former secretary. He found out about it later on.
Yeah.
Jim Mattis found out about that this week. The president thinks it's a good idea.
Yeah. No, there's channels sometimes, but ultimately he's making these decisions. And a lot of people said, we want a business person, someone who. If you're, for instance, a publicly traded company, you have a report card every 3 months.
You're right.
You have to make decisions really quickly. And if something is not working, you have to act very quickly. And this is something that President Trump brings to the job that no other president has, in part because he has a completely different background. And, of course, we know he has a different temperament.
Yeah. You endorse ruthlessness. I know what you're kidding.
There is one other thing here, which I think is worth saying. When you're trying to make foreign policy on a global basis, not only Afghanistan, as I said, but Iran, Iraq, the Middle East peace process, North Korea, and you have a national security advisor as respected and high profile as John Bolton, who is being reported to publicly disagree on many of those policy decisions the president is making. It becomes untenable. You just can't say.
Well, with all due respect, can I say one thing, though?
Please.
These players around the world did not like John Bolton. Our European ally, right? So, the fact of the matter is, almost anyone who's been critical of Trump's foreign policy they've zeroed in on the warmonger himself, John Bolton.
And then no matter what the president does on this front, he can't win. The press and many are not fans of John Bolton, not fans of his sort of in-your-face military style, and this is going to be greeted to I think what you had touched on, instability of the White House, but it would be instability, I think, that a lot of the zealots, might scratch their heads and say, all right, this isn't good, when in fact, if it's going the Jim Mattis way, where he's going to be, not rushed to judgment on keeping troops in Syria or not getting rid of them right away, that this could be part of a process that would be deemed favorable.
Well, Neil, you can look at it 2 ways. If you don't like Trump, you can look at the revolving door in the White House as he doesn't have a grip, he doesn't know what he's doing, or you can look at it like Charles does, and you can say, wow, if something doesn't work, he's quick. He doesn't let it sit there and stew. He gets rid of it and he goes on to the next one. So it depends. If you are a fan of Trump, you think this is beautiful.
This was a couple of years.
We'll probably find out in John Bolton's book.
I'm
sure John Bolton will do a book.
Fan. I think that's President Trump's modus operandi as a private citizen and as a president.
I guess what I was trying to get at there, guys, and I don't know if you agree with this, there's a lot of criticism that his shoot from the hip policies in the Middle East, and then it cut both ways, and Bolton sort of embodied that. And along he comes to say, all right, well, maybe I'm going to analyze this a little bit more. The Syrian pullout that he shelved when it was raised in March. This is going to be potentially unsettling to the entire Middle East, so he shelved it. So maybe this is a step in a direction that people who are in the military might welcome.
I think they would. Certainly those who are more judicious, less willing to use force will. Also, going into a re-election mode, to have a national security advisor out of sync with the president, where both what Charles said is correct, too, our allies don't like him, but also it sends mixed messages.
That used to be a badge of honor, though, to this president. Right?
It may well have been. That was then, this is now.
Right.
And the president wants peace and prosperity in an election year, not conflict around the world.
But back when we were negotiating with China, I think a lot of people, he did that as a message to China that they should be fearing Bolton.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, when we were talking about, the trade negotiations and sticking things to China, I think,
I see what you're saying.
that was a very strategic move back then.
All right. Well, John Bolton has written back, tweeted back. I guess they anyway, he said, I offered to resign last night, and President Trump said, let's talk about it tomorrow. Now, the president said this was decided last night. He's more or less going out saying, all right, I offered to resign. He said, we'll talk about it tomorrow. We're not quite sure, skinny here. What we can say is Bolton is out anyway. Don't let the screen door hit you on the way out.